So, a new research poll from CNBC Change Research is basically looking at six swing states, states that are going to be entirely necessary for the candidate to win the race. And if we're being honest, the race is probably going to be won or lost in these states. Many of the other states already have a bias in regards to the way that they go in elections. California tends to go for Democrat, New York tends to go for Democrat, Alabama tends to go for Republican. That's what I mean by that. Certain states are kind of hardened in regards to whether they lean right or to the left. Well, swing states, not so much. And because not so much for those swing states, the candidates put more resources and more emphasis on trying to get those states to come over into their side. Back in 2016, and just so we're clear, we're talking about Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, according to the polling, Trump and Biden are basically neck and neck. Donald Trump has a 1% advantage, 48% to Joe Biden's 47%. But basically, these guys are locked in a virtual tie in all of these swing states. Based on the polling methodology, 5,787 likely voters in six states from April 17th to 18th with a margin of error of plus and minus 1.3. I want you to see something else. So Trump 47.5, Biden 46.8, third party candidate 3.9%. Meaning the third party candidate, well, that group, even though that group is small, can influence the election itself just because of the spread and the closeness of the spread between Trump and Biden. Meaning a small group can end up playing kingmaker. It's not also in addition to the vote tally being split, meaning whether people go for Trump or Biden. You also have a situation where that split isn't isolated to the vote tally. That split goes all the way down, meaning in the way that they handle the economy, the way that they handle the coronavirus, the trust in them to handle either the economy or the coronavirus. You have a public in these states that are basically split down the middle between the two candidates on a host of issues, not just the election itself. For example, handling the coronavirus, making healthcare more affordable, preventing another pandemic, recovering from a recession, preventing another pandemic, 51% Biden, 49% Trump. Recovering from recession, 50% Biden, 50% Trump. The economy, 52% Trump, 48% Biden. Creating jobs, 51% Trump, 49% Biden. Helping your pocketbook, 51% Trump, 49% Biden. Putting the middle class first, 52% Biden, 48% Trump. Making healthcare more affordable, 52% Biden, 48% Trump. Like, that's pretty wild, right? I mean, basically, despite Trump taking more of a hit in the polling in regards to his handling of the coronavirus and taking more criticism in regards to his handling of the coronavirus, he basically has been able to maintain his own in the very states that are going to matter the most in regards to the election. This is where the election is going to be won and lost. If your name is Joe Biden, it should be a little bit concerning to you that the public is looking at Donald Trump, how Donald Trump has handled this particular virus, understands or distrusts Donald Trump to the tune of like 30% in regards to the scientists and everything else, disagrees with him on this push to reopen the economy, and to some degree believes that Trump has been responsible for loss of life because of the incompetence that was baked into the way he responded to the virus and the amount of time he took to actually respond. And nevertheless, despite that being true, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party cannot show an opposing viewpoint where the public will latch on to that particular viewpoint as compared to the Republican bill and the Republican legislation that these guys are pushing. If your name is Joe Biden, that should be a little bit disconcerting. I mean, basically, Donald Trump has agency in this process while Joe Biden is stuck at home. Because Trump has agency in this process, he can make moves that allows him to try to get a larger share of the vote tally and engage in much more full-throated politics because he has a bully pulpit. And again, Joe Biden is effectively on the sidelines. This inability for Democrats to make an ideological point of view to contrast the Republican point of view is dragging down Joe Biden's numbers. That's what I think. That's what I'm pinning the comparison to Joe Biden and Donald Trump on, and the reason why Joe Biden can't necessarily get in any leeway within the context of the polling. Joe Biden is being protected by media. Joe Biden has a rape charge against him that, again, media is pretending doesn't necessarily exist. Joe Biden was not heavily criticized by media in regards to the positions that he's taken in the past. The lies that Joe Biden had made in the 80s on civil rights that the media clearly has to know about, they don't necessarily bring it up, nor do they challenge him on it. And despite media taking this light tact with Joe Biden, and being scathing in their criticism of Trump, Joe Biden still only breaks even and is even losing by 1 point in these swing states. That is not a good result, but it does present opportunity for the left. I want to talk about all of this right now. Welcome to Late Night Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe, and of course, you can always support PayPal or Patreon. This has been what the public has been seeing between Trump and Joe Biden.
You've been criticizing President Trump for his response, sort of the slowness of the response for weeks now, but a few recent polls suggest that public approval has actually increased of the president's sort of job performance. And I wonder why you think the public doesn't see his leadership the same way as you do.
Well, I'm not suggesting what the public sees about his leadership. Let me take the last question first. What I'm suggesting is that I know what has to be done in the following, that faster is better than slower. Things we need now, not tomorrow, not yesterday, but months ago or a month ago, and the president's not acting. Now, I don't care whether the president's numbers are going up and down. And yes, and I noticed that the president's numbers of the public have gone up in handling this crisis, but they haven't gone up in terms of his presidency.
Gallup did show he is now at 49% job approval, which is a reversal from a few weeks ago. So it's just an interesting development. It does suggest that the American people see him as a stronger leader than you've been maybe characterizing him.
Well, I hope that he does. He's so strong that he's up way above that because we need the help now.
Incoherent, I have no idea what that means. This, again, is not plucked or cherry picking. There are a litany of these videos that are out there. Pretty much every time Joe Biden gives some kind of statement, there's something incoherent or something that doesn't make sense in the statement. The public clearly has been watching this.
After the presentation we just saw about the heat and the humidity, is it dangerous for you to make people think they would be safe by going outside in the heat, considering that so many people are dying in Florida, considering that this virus has had an outbreak in Singapore, places that are hot and are humid?
Here we go. The new headline is Trump asks people to go outside. That's dangerous. Here we go. Same old group. You ready? I hope people enjoy the sun. And if it has an impact, that's great. I'm just hearing this, not really for the first time. I mean, there's been a rumor that, a very nice rumor that you go outside in the sun or you have heat and it does have an effect on other viruses. But now we get it from one of the great laboratories of the world, I have to say. Covers a lot more territory than just this. This is probably an easy thing, relatively speaking, for you. I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure. That if you could, and maybe you can, maybe you can't. Again, I say maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not a doctor, but I'm like a person that has a good, what.
But sir, you're the president.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that? The heat and the light relative to certain viruses, yes, but relative to this virus?
Not as a treatment. I mean, certainly fever is a good thing. When you have a fever, it helps your body respond. But not as I've not seen heat or light.
I think it's a great thing to look at. I mean, okay.
Respectfully, sir, you're the president, and people tuning into these briefings, they want to get information and guidance and want to know what to do.
Here's the thing, Trump making the argument, look, I'm not a doctor. Well, despite not being a doctor, Trump had been advising people on taking, what is it, hydroquinone or whatever the medication is called, the malaria drug. That drug has not shown any propensity to do anything for the virus. By the same token, it has killed people. So, yeah, he may not be a doctor today, but that doesn't necessarily stop him from discharging medical advice. 3%. That's all. Doctors and Fauci and these other people get 60% or more. So they don't trust these press briefings. And yet, again, he's still breaking even with Joe Biden.
You're not harder to make sure to make sense to, I'll put it another way. It makes no sense. It makes no sense.
That's right, Joe Biden. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Joe Biden has worked himself into this position that he is against Medicare for all so thoroughly that even in the middle of a pandemic, he can't wedge himself away from it to say all of these bills should be covered. And we don't necessarily want people to be hit by a bill or create a disincentive for those people to go get checked out. This is disqualifying to me. Understand what I mean? Him not accepting Medicare for all is utterly and entirely disqualifying to me. It's popular policy. The majority of the population is for it. The overwhelming majority of Democrats are for it. And Joe Biden is against it. That's my litmus test. The expansion of college or getting rid of college debts, not to mention free public college. Those things are my litmus tests. And again, those policies are popular. The rub is, why does the Democratic Party, and let me ask this a different way, or let me say this a different way. If you had millions of people that ideologically stood beside me making this very specific argument that Medicare for all is a litmus test, this is a required position at this point, considering the pandemic, and not just that, considering we don't want people going bankrupt because they don't have access to health care. If you get millions of people standing beside you with that particular perspective, your chances of getting that policy concession goes up. If you don't make the argument, and if you're not necessarily willing to withhold your support for those policies, you allow a race to the bottom, where not only do you get marginalized, your legitimacy and your ability to actually have leverage in the political process is that much more diminished. We've been looking at elections wrong. Now, the thing is, for this particular election, with these swing states and with the vote tally so narrow, even if you don't have millions, a few thousand may be enough to turn the tally in regards to whether or not one candidate wins or another candidate wins. You saw some of these votes were like 10,000, 20,000 votes. The point I'm making here is, even without millions, if you have the potential to stand in solidarity, or if you stand in solidarity, especially if it becomes almost like a law of nature or word of God itself, that these are the policies that we are not willing to deviate from or go down below, the race to the bottom is over, then your chances of getting those, especially if the candidate believes, oh my God, I will potentially lose this race and they have the numbers in order to do it, this gives you the much better chance to get concessions, as opposed to acquiescing and folding yourself into the Democratic Party. We have been looking at elections wrong. We've been looking at this with the notion of less harm. The Democratic Party tends to narrow the focus of people when they're looking at elections to one specific election. But elections can't be viewed in that sense in any real terms. The elections have to be viewed over the context of time. A choice that you make in an election is a point, but it may not necessarily be the point, especially if your position is less about getting a person elected and more about getting your policy accomplished. If you can't get your Hail Mary where you can take power, then at the very least, you may have the capacity to influence the political space just based on your capacity of leverage. That leverage comes from credibility of being willing to tank it all. Just like a union saying, I'm going on strike because there's some levels to which I am not willing to accept. It's the same thing in a political space for the left when it is in a subordinate position to the Democratic Party or to the establishment that is in somewhat of a stronger position. You may have no leverage to get them to take on your position under normal circumstances, but if you have the numbers that can sufficiently make them lose, then to some degree you gain leverage in the political process. You just have to be courageous enough to go through with it, standing on this notion of principle and standards. Again, The election results go beyond just this notion of whether or not a particular candidate wins or loses. It also goes to your legitimacy in the political space and what the party believes you will be willing to accept going forward. Say for the moment you get Joe Biden elected, and say Joe Biden privatizes Social Security. If Joe Biden was running against Ted Cruz, would the Democratic Party say, hey, you got to vote for Joe Biden because you can't necessarily let Ted Cruz in, despite the fact that he would have privatized Social Security? And if you're willing to lower your standards to such a degree where the guy would privatize Social Security, you still give him your vote because you're still terrified of the other party member, what does that say from the standpoint of the lurch to the right that the country has just taken, and your inability to have any level of accountability in the political process that effectively has co-signed that lurch to the right? I'm making the point that looking at elections must be done over the context of time. And in progressives folding themselves into the Democratic Party, you've had one lurch to the right after the next, which each narrow focus specific election, which ignores the fact that the country had been moving further and further to the right because lefties gave up all notions of accountability. So the Democratic Party just believed lefties will be willing to pretty much accept anything, blue no matter who, and would even argue that it's lefties' responsibility to get those Democrats elected. The argument that the lefties need to basically make is, do you in the Democratic Party care so much about not giving concessions that you're willing to let Trump win? That's the question. The question is not, it's not lefties' responsibility to get somebody elected that don't back their policies. I mean, let's be honest. Joe Biden, you will be hard pressed to leave Joe Biden alone with a butter knife, let alone trying to support somebody who doesn't necessarily represent your policy interests. You and the Democratic Party are not on the same side. And because you're not on the same side, it is not your responsibility to get their candidate who they wanted into office. Now, if you are standing on a certain degree of principle where you say these are the policies that I'm willing to back somebody over, and Joe Biden makes those concessions in order to get your support, that is the pathway for him to beat Donald Trump. Now, the question for the Democratic Party and for moderates is that if you really want to give Joe Biden the best chance possible in order to beat Donald Trump, then why is Joe Biden not willing to acquiesce to these policies? After all, the policies are popular from the standpoint of the American public, and we've been told that Donald Trump eats babies, Donald Trump kicks puppies, Donald Trump puts kids and toddlers in cages, Donald Trump is destroying our habitable environment with accelerating climate change, meaning it's an existential threat at that point. And yet, despite all of those things apparently supposedly being true that the Democratic Party makes the point of, they are not willing to engage in policy concessions that the American public, for the most part, agrees with. Why is losing to Donald Trump more important to you than acquiescing to the policies? That's the question that needs to be asked. That's the framing of this particular conversation and this question that the left needs to appropriate, not this nonsense of voter shaming. It's not your responsibility to get Joe Biden elected. It is our responsibility to attend to this notion of policy and being willing to stand on a certain degree of principle to prevent a race to the bottom that gets incentivized each time the left is willing to give up some standard in order to vote blue no matter who, purely and entirely out of fear and cowardice. That has to stop. And until that stops, nothing changes. The only point I'm making is that basically your way, your pathway to getting policy accomplished is standing under a banner of these are the policies that we're willing to accept. Take it or leave it. And be willing to stand there. Understanding that over a larger context of time, the fact that you're willing to make that stand now means later they understand that you either accept this or lose. Meaning it becomes almost like a word of God that you have to attenuate yourself to certain policies, otherwise you have no chance in the political space. When you get there, you get change. You actually start getting policies that you're looking for. You actually start getting leverage in your political space, in your political process. That is the pathway that lefties need to take going forward, not this notion of acquiescing to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was perfectly willing to lose to Donald Trump if it meant stopping Sanders, which means the party that has told you you have nowhere else to go for God knows how long was willing to go elsewhere and tank it if it meant preventing Sanders from ruling that party for a generation. This is massively important for you to understand. And this is why I'm keep making the point that the pathway for lefties is to do something different than what they've always done. And that difference is to look at the party politic, not as if you're a part of the party at the point where the party is not backing your policy proposals, but as a movement and as people within a movement that is looking for the higher cause of policy. Even if we can't take power, we should be able to influence the political space and stand there in solidarity, not acquiescing and not folding into a party that doesn't back your interests. In the same way that unions negotiate for contracts, it would be weird if a union just says, okay, we don't want anything in this process. No union would give unconditional support to the company. All support in this case is conditional, and the same thing should be true in the political space. The left has been doing politics wrong. We've been looking at this all wrong. It is time to look at it with different eyes. Learn the lessons from 2020. Like, share, subscribe.